Here's the 30-second lesson on what legends know. Never practice nunchucks in a crowded room. Never eat chole before a road trip. Always take your shirt off before you iron it. Don't take a call near a swimming pool. And don't forget, saving is not investing. Legends don't just save, they invest in mutual funds. Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
All around him, the missionary Ippolito Desideri of Pistoia would remember as he journeyed through the Depsang plains early in the 18th century. There was arid, barren desolation and horror. The bleached bones of men and animals littered the landscape, left behind by the thousands of merchants who'd made their way to Lhasa each summer to buy the special kind of wool, very white, very long, and extraordinarily fine. Kashmir's shawls were spun from this wool, and the lives that were sacrificed on the high mountain passes to get it. French women, one contemporary account records, were warned against wearing Kashmiri shawls before they married for fear of leading suitors to believe that they are possessed of an unbridled love of luxury. Earlier this week, China and India said they had reached an agreement to disengage troops who have been facing off for 4 years along the very path Ippolito traversed. Although both China and the Ministry of External Affairs have shared no details on the terms of their agreement, External Affairs Minister Subramaniam Jaishankar has said it means, I quote, "We have gone back to where the situation was in 2020. That means Indian patrols should now be able to head west to an arc of positions close to the line of actual control in Depsang, known as patrol points 9, 10, 11, 12 and 13. The People's Liberation Army had blocked access to these points, halting Indian patrols at a rock outcrop called Bottleneck, east of India's last big military outpost at Budse. For their part, critics of the agreement have been pointing out that the PLA will retain control of a network of roads and outposts it has built well west of the line of actual control. That means the PLA can at any point in the future choke Indian patrols more or less at will. The devil isn't in the details though. The real issue is where India's frontier with China actually lies, not a few kilometers of ancient trading route. To agree on this larger issue needs deep reflection on the claims of territorial sovereignty both China and India have made. But nationalism in both countries makes a dispassionate dialogue on this issue very difficult. 11 years ago, the scholar Manoj Joshi recorded 4 tents, 9 men and a dog appeared 19 kilometers west of the line of actual control on the banks of the Chipchap, the northernmost of 3 rivers which cut across the Depsang plains. The incursion, which was discovered on the eve of a visit of former Chinese Premier Li Keqiang to New Delhi, mystified many in India at the time. Less than a month before that, China's President Xi Jinping had called for deeper cooperation between the armed forces of the two countries, and I quote, to deepen mutual military and security trust. And then there was this intrusion. Faced with the PLA's presence, India responded by dispatching an Indo-Tibetan border police patrol who pitched their tents just across from the Chinese on the riverbank. The mini crisis ended after India agreed to dismantle tin sheds it had erected in Chumar, south of the Depsang plains, which the PLA claimed violated earlier agreements not to engage in any new construction on the LAC. Even though the Chipchap incursion generated national headlines, similar incidents had been erupting along the line of actual control in Depsang for several years. In September 2008, for example, the PLA destroyed stores and fuels dumped by the ITBP at Budse. A similar incident took place in 2009. The PLO also began work on a road loop running south of the Chipchap River, which allowed its 4-wheel drive vehicles to respond and to obstruct Indian patrols headed east to the LAC. There was more friction in 2015 when a PLA patrol arrived almost at the gates of Butse before being detected just 1.5 kilometers from the post. Later that year, Indian soldiers responded by dismantling a shed put up by the PLA at Bottleneck and confiscating solar lighting panels set up in the area. Little attention was paid to this push and shove, but in retrospect, its meaning was evident. The PLA had long been asserting in military to military dialogues that the LAC ought to run along the westernmost line it occupied during the War of 1962. Following the war, Indian outposts throughout Depsang had been overrun and even troops stationed at the ancient caravanserai of Daulat Beg Oldi were evacuated to reinforce defense lines along the road to Leh, the most important city in Ladakh. After the war, the PLA had pulled back eastwards to positions linked by roads to the rest of the Tibetan plateau where they could be supplied easily. Later, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi ordered the Indian Army to expand its patrolling into some of these areas from which the PLA had pulled back, establishing what India now asserts to be the limits of the LAC. The PLA, though, continued to argue that India could not lay claim to territories it had lost in war. The more complex and deeper truth was that neither country had sound historical reasoning to back its claims of sovereignty in the region. As Ippolito discovered, nobody lived on these brutal heights separating Tibet and Kashmir. And where no one lived, no one had troubled themselves to rule. For centuries, nomad armies and warlords had swept through Depsang, raiding caravans and trading centers. Today, a critical strategic airbase and logistics hub, Daulat Beg Oldi was once merely the burial place of the medieval warlord Said Khan, who died on his way home to Yarkand in Xinjiang while returning home from an expedition to pillage Leh. The two great empires of the 19th century, China's Qing dynasty and Britain, made no real effort to exercise direct control of the region since it yielded too little revenue to be worth a large military expense. To ward off perceived challenges from Russia, though, the British launched a murderous invasion of Tibet in 1903-1904. That invasion led to the border being drawn between India's northeast and Tibet in 1914 by the British administrator Henry McMahon. The border he arrived at, based on amateur cartographical work by missionaries, was never endorsed either by the Qing dynasty or by Lhasa. Expansive nationalist fictions replaced this imperialist cartography as the Kuomintang nationalists came to power in China in 1911. Kuomintang maps claimed the borders of China lay along the Kunlun range on the northern fringes of Tibet. In 1958, an official Chinese map asserted power over the whole of what was then India's Northeast Frontier Agency, with the exception of Tirap, as well as parts of Ladakh, Himachal Pradesh, and Uttar Pradesh. For its part, India's first post-independence map, published in 1950, showed the borders with Tibet in Ladakh as undefined in a broad wash of yellow, just as it should be noted as Pakistan's maps did. This act of accuracy or geopolitical naivety, call it what you like, soon gave way to claims on territory India had never administered or militarily held in response to China's increasingly wild assertions. The PLA mounted a succession of military intrusions from 1955, trying to seize ground at Barahoti, the Shipkila in Himachal Pradesh, Korek, and Hipsang Khurd. Kurnak Fort in Ladakh was also occupied. In response to India's protests, China insisted the PLA was on its own territory. There were lethal clashes in Galwan in 1959 as India pushed up to what it said were its borders. Last-ditch efforts to hammer out the border through negotiations went nowhere. From June to December 1960, Manoj Joshi recalls, Chinese and Indian officials met in Beijing, New Delhi, and Yangon. The Chinese negotiators came armed with a map asserting their territory ran east of Daulat Beg Oldi, cutting across the Galwan River near its confluence with the Shyok River, then to where the Pangong Lake runs northwest and ends southwest of Demchok. That line approximates the positions China occupied in the War of 1962 and the ones it sought to push back to in 2020. The reasons for this assertion aren't hard to find. Ever since the global financial crisis in 2008, China has come to see itself as a truly great power, with the right to the deference of its neighbors and potential regional adversaries like India. New Delhi's increasingly close relationship with the West and the build-up of military infrastructure along the LAC irritated Beijing very deeply. The 9 men who appeared in Chip Chap together with their dog were delivering that message, though it wasn't clearly understood by many in Delhi back then. Even though military experts believe the PLA never intended for the 2020 clash in the Galwan River to spiral into a multi-year military crisis, events have served to demonstrate that protocols and agreements meant to avert armed conflict cannot guarantee peace. Ever since 2013, though, China has rejected Indian efforts to negotiate a border that approximates the LAC, and India, for its part, has refused to accept China's 1960 claims. So where do we go? The two countries both have much to gain from stability and a cooperative relationship. To develop this, however, both will have to show a political imagination that generations of their national leadership has demonstrated it lacks. I'm Praveen Swami and I'm a contributing editor to ThePrint. Thank you for watching this episode of Security Code.